June 28, 1919. The Treaty of Versailles marked the end of World War I and created a new world order. The treaty called for the creation of the League of Nations and the issuing of certain sanctions against Germany, who had lost the war. On that day, 90 delegations from the winning countries were invited to the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. Among the victors were representatives from a small, remote country that had become a global power in recent years, Japan.
We joined the war against Nazi Germany in August 1914, yet here we are not considered to be victors in our own right.
Would later write in his memoirs Baron Makino, an eminent member of the Japanese delegation. And indeed, once the treaty had been signed, the victors gathered on the front steps of the castle to parade in front of the cameras. US President Wilson, French Prime Minister Clemenceau, British Prime Minister Lloyd George, and Italian Prime Minister Orlando were all there, but the Japanese were not invited.
We were treated like poor parents that they reluctantly invited and forced to sit at the end of the table.
Baron Makino defended the principle of racial equality, which he wanted written into the Charter of the League of Nations. Despite support from the French, this project was delayed by President Wilson, who was from the American South where segregation reigned and only whites were considered equal. This humiliation in 1919 served as the opening chapter in the drama between Japan and the West.
It was my greatest defeat. Instead of an honest friendship, we would have mistrust. If only we had been recognized as equals, history could have taken a different turn.
In order to understand the tragedy of Japan, one must go back to 1868 and the Meiji era. Baron Makino witnessed this revolution.
I was born the son of a samurai in a Japan that was closed to the world and rooted in its traditions. My name, Makino Nobuaki, comes from Nobu, which means confidence and a desire for success. I hope I have honored that name. I was 7 years old in this picture. That year, the new emperor declared the Meiji era the era of enlightened government and openness to Western methods.
The Empire of the Rising Sun saw the West colonizing the rest of the world. In order to avoid the same fate, Japan decided to industrialize, developing its banks, army, and navy with help from Western countries. By doing so, it became one of the few non-white countries to be colonized. The Meiji slogan was Wakan Yosai, Japanese spirit, Western learning. Meiji Emperor Mutsuhito was the embodiment of this revolution. After being crowned in traditional ceremonial clothing, he adopted a more Western aesthetic, cutting his hair instead of keeping it long and wearing it in a bun, and cultivating a small, well-groomed beard and a mustache in line with the European image of virility. He would soon wear a military uniform when he appeared in public. In her official portrait, his wife, Empress Haruko, looked more like a Queen of England than an Asian princess.
In order to grow and develop, the country needed Western techniques that we lacked. That's why the emperor sent a mission to the US and Europe under the supervision of Minister Iwakura, so as to gather information across a variety of fields.
Since the first thing to be modernized was the army, he chose eminent samurai soldiers, the educated warrior class, who were the only ones allowed to bear arms and take part in war. The delegation, which also included experts, ambassadors, and professors, first traveled from Yokohama to San Francisco, then crossed the United States. meeting the American president in Washington, D.C., before continuing on to England, France, Germany, Russia, Austria, and Italy, finally returning home 2 years later in September 1873. Iwakura left in a kimono with his hair in a bun and came back with short hair, wearing a fitted coat and a top hat.
At his side during this 2-year journey was my father, Okubo Toshimichi, who was vice ambassador. I was also there as one of 60 teenagers and 5 young girls who enrolled in school in the areas we visited in order to immerse ourselves in local culture. I would stay in the United States for 3 years, long enough to master the language and grow to understand these strange foreigners. I remember being impressed by the noise and the fast pace of the railroad, as well as the smoke, which left black dust on our clothing. Men there stood up to give their seats to women and carried their luggage for them. We didn't have anything like that in Japan. In larger cities, the roads were paved and pedestrians walked on sidewalks. They all had leather shoes instead of wooden ones. No one was barefoot. The student in the bed next to mine in the dorm received a letter from his parents urging him to be wary of me because I was a heathen and a savage.
It may seem insignificant, but Makino Nobuaki was one of the first Japanese persons to ever face the notions of otherness and racism. At the same time, a new Japan was being born. But this new world also marked the death of the old one. In 1873, a conscription army was established, which was open to people from any social class. Samurai soldiers were asked to make way for these soldiers in uniforms. They soon lost their right to carry swords and travel on horseback, as well as having their fiefdoms and stipends taken away from them. A subset of the samurai quickly denounced the fast-moving changes in the country, revolting in January 1877 under the leadership of Saigo Takamori, the last samurai.
The emperor chose my father, Toshimichi, a great samurai, to lead his army in putting down the insurrection.
The rebellion, which was confined to the southern part of the country, ended in September 1877, when the insurgents met a crushing defeat. On one side was a group of brave men armed with swords, staging a final charge on horseback. And on the other, an organized army with disciplined foot soldiers and the devastating power of Gatling cannons bought from the United States. Samurai against samurai. Traditional Japan versus modern Japan. Saigo Takamori, the loser, committed seppuku, ritual suicide.
My father met a deadly fate as well. He was killed in an ambush on May 14th, 1878. I was 17 years old.
With this last stronghold of feudalism defeated, the road was clear for the modernization of the country, which seemed to be emerging from the Middle Ages. Powerful feudal lords became senior officials, military officers, politicians, bankers, and manufacturers. The samurai laid down their swords and put on suits and ties, but remained omnipresent, their fighter values as pervasive as ever. The ancient warrior's moral code, Bushido, became that of the army and the entire Japanese people.
Because I was the son of the glorious and loyal Okubo Toshimichi, I didn't have to attend the University of Tokyo for long. And without taking a single exam, I was sent to the London Embassy in 1880. I arrived in England in early spring. The fog was so thick, I couldn't even see an inch in front of me. I wondered if people could even live here, compared to Paris.
This diplomatic career opened Makino's mind. He was intrigued by the idea of parliamentarianism, but more skeptical of democracy.
The lion is a lion. The mouse is a mouse.
Which means that the strong and the weak cannot act on the same level. He would be named ambassador to Italy in 1896 and to Austria-Hungary 3 years later. Meanwhile, Makino's time in Europe solidified his open-mindedness as well as his natural skepticism of nationalism.
I learned that the world was full of people who don't know each other, but all believe themselves to be superior to the rest.
Thanks to its industrialization, the Empire of the Rising Sun became a major global power and gradually discovered its own colonial ambitions at the expense of weaker countries. The Japanese were guided by a certainty that they were a superior people, led by an emperor who was a direct descendant of Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun. On an economic level, they needed workers and new markets to sell their manufactured goods, but also the raw materials their country was sorely lacking. As a result, Japan started looking longingly at its neighbors. The Ryukyu Islands were the first to be swallowed up by the empire, followed by the island of Formosa, now Taiwan, in 1895, at the end of a Sino-Japanese war that was quickly won by the better-equipped army. Finally, and most importantly, after China was defeated, it was forced to give up its suzerainty over Korea, where Japan took its place. Japan's Imperial Army then found itself up against the imperialist forces of Russia, which also coveted the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria.
The war broke out in 1904 when I was the ambassador to Vienna. I saw gatherings in the streets to show support for Russia, and I realized there were none in support of Japan. In Europe, no one believed we had a chance because of the racial prejudices that led them to believe that whites were superior to Asians. A small country against the gigantic Russian Empire, David versus Goliath.
Yet it was the Russians who were defeated on the land and at sea. They were forced to cede the region of Port Arthur, part of Sakhalin, and abandon any hope of colonizing Manchuria, which became a Japanese economic protectorate. After this victory against a major European power, the world finally understood that Japan was a force to be reckoned with.
I understood that my country scared the West. When reporters asked me what I thought of the Yellow Peril, I was disgusted, but I had to try to reassure them. We aspired to be on the same level as the greatest global powers, but only in terms of civilization. The Yellow Peril was an illusion, just like the White Peril was in Japan.
It was time for Makino to say goodbye to Europe. The polyglot ambassador was called back to his home country in 1906 to serve the government as Minister of Education. That same year, Makino was anointed Baron by His Majesty, the Meiji Emperor. The man who passed for a liberal in the West would turn out to be a conservative minister who wanted to protect the people of Japan from what he called the decadence and immortality of certain Western ideals.
Individualism, the idea of wanting to enjoy one's life, and a desire for egalitarianism are not Japanese values. I urge our teachers to keep an eye on what their students are reading to preserve our sense of morality. But I know that one day, the common people of Japan will westernize themselves just like the elite.
This fear of a break with tradition was actually a fear of the democratization of education, and beyond that, a fear of democracy in general. Surprisingly, Baron Makino defended the purity of the Japanese spirit, even though he himself was the epitome of cosmopolitanism and westernization. He posed in a European style with a false collar, tie, cardigan, pocket watch, and an overcoat, while his wife wore a kimono. A perfect representation of Japan, one foot in the past and the other in the future. In 1907, when he was still only Minister of Education, he agreed to sponsor the constitution of a pacifist league.
Peace is our common good.
This conciliatory attitude angered the nationalists, who were calling for a military expansion against China. In 1913, Makino became Minister of Foreign Affairs. That same year, 3 Japanese men were killed in China, which the nationalists used as a pretext for war. Makino refused. An angry crowd protested beneath the ministry's windows, calling for the Baron to resign due to his lack of military ambition.
The next day, I learned that gangs had forced their way into my home to try to kill me. My wife had served them tea, but they naturally refused. Eventually, they left.
Makino had become the target of the militarists' anger.
But I maintain that when it comes to business, peace is more profitable than war.
War eventually caught up to Japan. But this was unexpected. It was a stroke of luck, a tremendous opportunity. For 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, Europe tore itself apart. The leading European powers were bogged down in the trenches, leaving the Asian markets to Japan. Not only did Japan do a lot of business, but it also seized the opportunity to declare war on Germany and managed to take possession of its territories in the Far East almost without firing a single shot. These included the Chinese peninsula of Shandong, which encompassed the city of Tsingtao, as well as the Mariana, Palau, Caroline, and Marshall Islands, getting dangerously close to the American islands of Hawaii. With a population of 55 million, the third largest naval fleet in the world, flourishing factories, and an expanding empire, Japan arrived at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 with a high level of confidence. The leader of the delegation was former Prime Minister Saionji Kinmochi. But Makino was the one who was actually leading the debates. The others struggled to keep up with the fast pace of the conversations in French and English. The Baron quickly realized that the Japanese, whose only participation in the war had been for their own benefit, were not very welcome. In addition, Baron Makino aggravated the Anglo-Saxons by calling for his country to be recognized as a great power, which he cleverly couched in support for the principle of racial equality. But the Paris Conference also saw 2 different Japanese powers facing off. That of the imperialists, who wanted to conquer territories by force, and that of the liberals, who supported free exchange, like Makino himself. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, a member of the delegation, was furious and stood against Makino.
These whites look down upon me and want to keep me on the sidelines. They colonize the world, but forbid us to do the same.
Makino received an order from Tokyo to double down on his position. He was not to give any ground regarding the annexation of the German territories conquered in 1913, especially the Chinese peninsula of Shandong. But in keeping with the right to self-determination, Wilson wanted it rightfully returned to China.
I must threaten to leave the conference if our control over Shandong, which is rich in coal, is not recognized by the leading powers.
In order to preserve the peace treaty, Wilson finally gave in. This concession allowed Japanese delegation to return home with its honor intact, but the strongest supporters of the regime, such as Prince Konoe, were convinced that the West was determined to deny Japan's right to exist. Baron Makino's conclusion was as follows.
More than ever before, we must be exemplary when dealing with the West.
While the refusal to accept racial equality fueled Japan's bitterness, it was not enough to drive them to join the nationalists. On the contrary, the dominating party in the 1920s was the Liberal Party, Minseito. Strong economic growth and an increase in international trade made territorial expansionism irrelevant, at least for now. But the United States were still concerned and forced the Japanese government to sign a treaty in 1922, limiting their naval construction program to 60% of the American fleet. That year, Prince Konoe entered the world of politics and made quite a stir when he denounced this naval agreement, saying that the West once again wished to put Japan in a stranglehold. As a supporter of the appeasement policy, Makino continued his ascent. He was now part of the inner circle of power, which had the emperor's ear. After the death of Meiji in 1912, his son, Emperor Taisho, took over. But by 1921, he was too sick, so the young Prince Hirohito was crowned regent.
Hirohito was still a young man in need of counsel. The young sprout needed a tutor. I was 60 years old when I became minister, and His Majesty was just 20. He could have been my grandson, so I spoke to him like a grandfather, a loving grandfather. Respect our past, Your Majesty. Promote harmony. Embrace the opinions of everyone, even people from different social classes, and above all, act as a divine guardian of the established order.
Makino dreamed of making the emperor like a king of England, above the party system, above the ideologies that reigned, but without governing. He wanted the emperor to let the government and the parliament act without him intervening. But in the case of trouble or strife, he could serve as an arbitrator, as nothing was done against the emperor's wish. The 1920s were a time of great political and social transformation. In keeping with the British model, the liberal Minseito party gradually strengthened the powers of parliament and undertook a slow slide towards democracy. In 1919, the right to vote, which had previously been reserved for the rich, was given to the middle class. The limited caste of rich samurai families had to make room for 3 million new voters. A small revolution was underway. Makino was not truly democratic. He wished to preserve the emperor's powers, but understood that democracy was not synonymous with the destruction of the throne.
If the right to vote strengthens national cohesion, then do not fear the people, my prince.
In 1925, seeing that the 1919 reform had gone smoothly, universal suffrage went into effect for all men aged 25 years or older. For once, Prince Konoe agreed with Makino.
Universal suffrage keeps the people in line, protecting us from revolutions and ensuring the elite will remain in power.
The same revolution transformed all of society. Until then, only the elite class had opened up to the world, while popular, rural Japan seemed frozen in time. But no longer. With its bicycles, cars, elegant people dressed in Western fashion, mogas, the local equivalent of flappers, its movie theaters, and even its first dance clubs, the Far East was on its way to becoming a hybrid Far West. While Tokyo's golden youth fell in love with jazz, the Ainu, inhabitants of the island of Hokkaido, were seemingly struck in the Neolithic age. Japan was a land of contrasts. Makino the liberal was light years from that social modernity too. After all, he was over 60 years old. Strangely, Konoe, the conservative 30-something, was much closer to it. After the peace conference, he visited France, Germany, England, and the United States. He fell in love with the food, the casual manners, and not having to take his shoes off whenever he entered a building. Always impeccably dressed, with a side part, an athletic, unrepentant golfer, and bisexual, he was a sort of snobbish aristocrat, a conservative who indulged in criticizing his own country. And he dared to call out the old-fashioned rituals that surrounded the emperor, the kind of blasphemy that would cost anyone else dearly. But who would risk telling off a member of one of the 5 greatest families in Japan? It was during Japan's Roaring Twenties that tragedy would strike. On September the 1st, 1923, an earthquake of 7.9 magnitude on the Richter scale devastated Kanto, the region of Tokyo and Yokohama.
It was complete desolation. The capital was destroyed. The earthquake also caused a massive fire that the firefighters couldn't put out because the water pipes were broken.
Over 100,000 people died. Hirohito was severely affected. He and his fiancée, future Empress Taimei, went to the scene of the disaster to comfort survivors. But he had another reason to be sad. He was supposed to be married just a few days later. Faced with the destruction of Tokyo, he considered delaying the ceremony. Makino disagreed with this move.
The earthquake was localized, whereas the marriage affected the whole nation because it represented the future of the crown. We couldn't let this event, no matter how serious, interfere with the affairs of the state.
Makino managed to recruit ministers and members of the Imperial family to his side, but Hirohito stood firm and postponed his wedding. Not only did Makino not take umbrage, he was actually pleased by the decision.
I cannot help but be proud that the prince chose to listen to his own conscience rather than the voice of his advisors. I predict that the future emperor will know how to make decisions on his own. That is very good.
The Prince Regent's trust brought Makino ever closer to the Imperial Palace. In 1925, he became the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal of Japan. making him the prince's top advisor and right-hand man. In 1926, upon his father's death, Hirohito was officially named emperor. The people of Japan cried out a triple banzai, which means long life, to celebrate the new emperor who inaugurated the Showa era, the era of enlightened peace. Like Makino, Fuminato Konoe was one of a small number of men who had access to the emperor whenever they wished. He had the affection of Hirohito, a small man bound by his rules and traditions who secretly envied him. The prince, 10 years his senior, cared little for protocol and sat in the emperor's presence, even daring to cross his legs, the ultimate show of insolence. He spoke to him not with Makino's deference, but in a more conversational tone. Konoe felt no need to act inferior. He considered himself equal in nobility and superior in intelligence. He was on his way up. In 1928, he successfully defended a bill to reduce public liberties, especially the freedom of expression. His turn towards conservatism was underway. The era of peace and prosperity was suddenly challenged by the 1929 crisis. The markets collapsed, and customs restrictions started penalizing Japanese exports. Japan was dependent on other countries. Despite its control of Korea, it lacked raw materials, had very limited farmland available, and was nearly incapable of feeding a population growing by 1 million per year. Losing the ability to sell its industrial products abroad would mean being faced with ruin. Known as the Zaibatsus, the major manufacturers like Mitsubishi and Nissan were severely affected by the crisis. Their executives, all from great noble families in this strange feudal capitalist system, hence pushed the government to once again embrace an expansionist policy in order to gain access to raw materials and markets without relying on foreign countries. In other words, they had to colonize, which meant war. For years, the army had believed that war on China would solve all the country's problems. The generals were particularly focused on Manchuria, a province known for its abundance. The 1.5 million square kilometer territory had seams of iron and coal, gold and bauxite, everything Japan was lacking. Japan already held interests there, notably the management of South Manchuria Railway, and a garrison of 10,000 men to ensure its safety. This small outfit, the Kwantung Army, was determined to wage war. It was scheming and searching for any excuse to take up arms.
In 1928, in an unbelievably vile act, Japanese soldiers assassinated the governor of Manchuria to provoke a Chinese response that would give them a reason to declare war against them. But China didn't fall for it. I immediately informed His Majesty Hirohito so that he could denounce the soldiers.
In reality, the emperor reacted more vigorously than Makino expected.
It's not a matter of the right to self-determination, nor of respect for China's sovereignty, but I cannot allow people to act behind my back. As commander of the nation's armies, my authority has been flouted.
But Prime Minister Tanaka, a nationalist, did not want to condemn the army. As a result, Hirohito forced him to resign immediately.
I always advised the emperor not to get too involved in politics. He had to be above it all. But what was the point of suggesting moderation when the army took action on its own? I could see the disaster coming, and I didn't know how to prevent it.
Prince Konoe didn't want war either. What he wanted was to liberate the Far East from Western imperialism. And to that end, he had to get along with China. Once that was achieved, he would replace Western domination with Japanese domination. Despite the failed plot, the extremists, whose motto was Nihon Sekai Ichi, meaning Japan is the #1 country in the world, swung into action. In November 1930, the Liberal Prime Minister Hamaguchi was seriously injured in an assassination attempt. He died just a few months later. These ultranationalists, who were revolted by capitalism, communism, and democracy, embraced the country's 1,000-year-old values: hierarchy, the emperor, force, and harmony. They rejected equality, liberalism, and other Western values that corrupted tradition. After the modernity of the 20s, the 30s were a more reactionary time. The military budget exploded, and the generals were more present in the emperor's inner circle. Nationalist propaganda intensified and began its fight to win public opinion. Once again, the soldiers of the Kwantung Army took action. On September 18, 1931, Japanese soldiers detonated a small bomb on the South Manchuria railway line they were charged with protecting, causing maximum noise but minimal damage. Barely a meter of rail was damaged. Yet the Kwantung Army claimed China was responsible for the attack and immediately went on the offensive. Two months later, after a lightning-fast war, Manchuria had been conquered. The government and the emperor were faced with a fait accompli. Makino neither saw nor understood anything.
At first, I thought our army had acted in self-defense. By the time the truth came out, it was too late.
The emperor didn't denounce the conspirators, but did call for military operations to stop. He was told it was impossible. Makino was at a loss and didn't know what advice to give the emperor. He had wanted to turn him into a constitutional monarch, to preserve his divine character as guarantor of the country's unity. Instead, he merely helped leave the field clear for the military that only the emperor could stop. Konoe was just as surprised. As a defender of Pan-Asian nationalism, he was against war with China. But once the soldiers went on the offensive, he had no choice but to embrace it. Especially since the affair provoked an international reaction. China complained of the attacks to the League of Nations.
This region is a Chinese province that has belonged to China since the 8th century. Much like Manchuria, it is an integral part of the Chinese territory, and consequently, Japan has no right to occupy it. There were only two options: either to denounce our army and acknowledge in front of the entire world that neither the government nor the emperor had any control over our military, or to legitimize the takeover to the League of Nations. I resigned myself to the fact that there was no good solution, only one that was less bad than the other.
As a result, Hirohito signed antedated decrees ordering the forces stationed in Korea to enter Manchuria, where they already were. The situation was now entirely out of Makino's control. The military had the upper hand. In January 1932, the generals pushed the government to plan a military operation in Shanghai, the heart of the Chinese economy, after a new frame-up. For the first time, the Navy deployed their aircraft carriers, launching a veritable war. This time, the European powers thumped the table. The League of Nations got involved, even sending camera crews to the front to film these unprecedented images. It was during the Battle of Shanghai that the world first caught sight of suicide attacks committed by young Japanese soldiers who threw themselves into the Chinese trenches with their explosives. Propaganda footage hailed them as heroes and glorified them for having sacrificed their lives for the good of their country. These were the first kamikazes. After 3 months of fighting, a ceasefire was signed. In the meantime, the Japanese military had conquered Manchuria and created a puppet state, Manchukuo, led by a puppet ruler, the last emperor of China, Puyi. Japanese propaganda went to great lengths to portray an image of a model Manchukuo that was modernizing thanks to Japan's guidance. The League of Nations had no choice but to condemn the conquest of Manchuria.
Son Excellence, Monsieur Matsuoka, délégué du Japon. I call on His Excellency, Monsieur Matsuoka, delegate of Japan.
That Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Delegate Matsuoka gave one last angry speech before leaving the room, followed by his collaborators.
To me, it was a day of grieving. We gave up everything to the military. We were heading for the precipice.
Yet that was not enough for the generals, some of whom supported the idea of a military coup.
On May 15, 1932, some young naval officers broke into the residence of Prime Minister Inokai and shot him twice in the head, killing him. The assassins then made their way to my home, but they were stopped by the police. I narrowly escaped death.
The putschists had also intended to kill Charlie Chaplin, who was touring Japan at the time, and who nationalists saw as a symbol of Western decadence. Chaplin was supposed to visit Prime Minister Inukai's home, where the assassins were waiting. But at the last minute, he changed his schedule and decided to attend a sumo wrestling match instead. Lucky for him. The rebels who were arrested were given minimal sentences and quickly pardoned.
What kind of lesson was that? They killed the Prime Minister and tried to kill me, the Lord Keeper of the Private Seal, and were hardly punished at all.
The military had taken control and pardoned even the most violent acts. the emperor was left with no choice but to sign any and all decrees that were submitted to him. Makino had no more advice to give. When French journalist André Dubosc interviewed him at his house in August 1934, Makino was guarded, spoke very little, and appeared meditative. He tried to provide reassurance about Japan's military ambitions.
Sir, nothing can happen unless the emperor agrees to it.
The reporter pressed him, asking, "What if Japan attacks China?" Makino repeated,
Nothing can be done, sir, without the emperor's consent.
But in reality, the emperor had already given up. Konoe was on the verge of taking power. He was impressed by Hitler and shared his belief that a so-called superior race had the right to living space. This shared ideology would soon lead to the Holy Alliance of fascist regimes. In 1935, as the empire prepared for war, Makino resigned as Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal.
It was time for me to retire, to distance myself from decisions I do not approve, and to make way for Prince Konoe.
Pessimistic and consumed by guilt for having failed, he left, issuing one final warning to Hirohito, who was giving free rein to the military.
May it please your majesty, do not let the war with China turn into a war with the United States.
But the retired man the emperor had anointed count was still too influential not to be seen as a threat to the ultranationalists. He was also a symbol of a time when Japan had wished to open itself to a world and dreamed of growth without war. In February 1936, during another coup attempt, a group of fanaticized young officers assassinated the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Domestic Affairs, and the Emperor's Chamberlain, but missed Count Makino once again, who was taking the waters in a rural ryokan at the time. This time, Hirohito demanded the perpetrators be punished. To satisfy the emperor, some of them were sentenced to death. In June 1937, it was finally time to act for Fuminado Konoe, the youngest prime minister of Japan at age 45. Just like Nazi Germany, he asserted a right to expansion.
To save ourselves, just like Germany, we must destroy the Western status quo. We must demand that all powers open their colonies so that all nations have equal access to the markets and natural resources of colonized territories.
Konoe sided with the military. The Empire of the Rising Sun needed a living space, and so the die was cast.
What madness! Everything we had been working towards for the past 70 years was ruined, and I could do nothing about it.
In 1937, Japan attacked China once more. World War II began, and the weapons would not be silenced until 1945. Nearly 30 million people would die in Asia. With a prince at the head of the government, Japan once again became that which it had never truly ceased to be, a feudal regime, where the new samurai were almighty. The officers all wore swords, which were useless in modern warfare but steeped in symbolism. The modernization of Japan had failed. It remained purely superficial, confined to techniques. The military held power over society. Propaganda determined public opinion. And the younger generation was fanaticized by schools in the service of imperialism. The new samurai rejected the idea of democracy, seen as a Western ideal, and exalted the past and traditions. Westerners who visited the island all wanted to see these symbols of the country's past showcased by its leaders. Cherry blossoms, the sacred deer of Nara, the great Buddha of Kamakura, the harmonious temples with their centuries-old trees, and the fascinating beauty of the geishas. And of course, in the background, the majestic Fuji-san, dominating the Japanese landscape, history, and people. But this was a picture postcard image of Japan frozen in time, an illusion. Because nothing is permanent, this land of contradictions was affected by the war and the ever-changing world around it. Challenging the most powerful country in the world led Japan to its defeat. When Konoe realized it, he tried to hold the military in check, but it was too late. The army had Hirohito's support. Konoe had no choice but to resign just before the attack on Pearl Harbor. How ironic. The liberal Makino had been pushed aside by the nationalistic Konoe, who was in turn being pushed aside by militarists. After the war broke out, and after the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Americans imposed their order on the world. In December 1945, Konoe preferred to commit suicide rather than be imprisoned. As for the Democrats, they sought out the old liberal in retirement to ask him to take the reins of the party and become prime minister. But Makino was too old and too sad. He had never wanted war, and he lacked the courage to rebuild the ruins caused by militarists and nationalists, but also by his own errors and those of his emperor. He died in 1949, inconsolable from having failed to convince his country to embrace reconciliation. Emperor Hirohito, deprived of his divinity and his power by the Americans in 1945, posed as a victim of the militarists to make people forget that he had given in to them. He would reign as discreetly as possible until his death in 1989. The Empire of the Rising Sun was placed under the supervision of the United States, and in 1947, it was presented with a constitution forbidding it from having an army. However, contemporary Japan still struggles to face up to its history. It oscillates between denial and amnesia, always careful not to accuse the emperor. In Japan, the war is a past that remains ever present.